Good morning, fellow babies. A great day in store for you here in the metro area.
But the senator, while insisting he was not intoxicated, could not explain his nudity.
For hundreds of years, people from all walks of life have reported sightings of a large hairy animal walking on 2 feet. The scientific community has dismissed these sightings as hoaxes, hallucinations, or misidentified bears. But is there another option? Is it possible that there is an ape, the largest of the great apes, unrecognized and unclassified by modern science, roaming the forest of North America? Please join us as we seek the answer to this compelling question. You have arrived at the intersection of myth and science, of fact and folklore. You have arrived at Bigfoot Crossing.
Hey fellow babies, welcome to Bigfoot Crossing, the intersection of myth and science, of fact and folklore. I'm Michael Willey, I'll be your guide on this little expedition. This is the very first episode of the podcast, but is actually the 14th episode of Bigfoot Crossing in total. Now how is that possible, you ask? Well, Bigfoot Crossing began as a radio program on WAKM AM 950 in Franklin, Tennessee, in 2016. We lasted 13 episodes before we had to bring the show to a close due to a lack of sponsors. And after several years of trying to get the show back on the air and looking for sponsors in fits and starts, I decided to do what numerous people had recommended and turn Bigfoot Crossing into a podcast. And here we are. Fellow babies, if you feel like you missed out on a cultural event because you missed the radio program version of Bigfoot Crossing, don't worry. All 13 episodes of Bigfoot Crossing are archived at the Bigfoot Crossing YouTube channel, which can be found at bit.ly/Bigfoot-Crossing. Now there's also a link to the YouTube channel on the Bigfoot Crossing website at www.bigfootcrossing.net. And while you're there on the website, be sure to check out the BFC web store.
Shameless plug.
This very first episode of Bigfoot Crossing is brought to you by thinkbeforeyoudrink.us. Change your water, change your life with Kangen water. I'll tell you, fellow babies, it is the only water I drink. For more information and an eye-opening demonstration, go to www.thinkbeforeyoudrink.us. Now let me explain a little bit about this podcast and our approach. The title of the podcast is a reference to a Bigfoot crossing a road, which is where a majority of sightings take place. But first and foremost, a crossing is an intersection. It's a place where people can meet and talk and exchange information. Bigfoot Crossing is the intersection of myth and science, of fact and folklore. Our goal is to educate, inform, and entertain. Now, basically, anyone who holds a strong belief in the truth of something is a believer. So based upon the evidence and thousands of reported sightings, I believe that a large animal, unrecognized and unclassified by modern science, is roaming the forests of North America. But now this is just not this is not a show for just quote unquote believers. In fact, I want skeptics to listen to the show, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But all points of view are welcome here at Bigfoot Crossing. Whether you believe Bigfoot to be a real creature, and a 2014 survey tells us that about 30% of Americans do, or whether you're a skeptic, or whether you're somewhere in between, you are welcome here, and your feedback is welcome as well. At the end of each episode, I will tell you how you can contact me to give me your opinion and feedback on each episode or to ask questions. Keep it clean and constructive, people. There's no need to be hateful. Come on, man. Now let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in West Virginia in a little town called Great Cacapon and grew up fishing on the banks of the Potomac River. When I was in the 7th grade, I bought a book on Bigfoot at the school book fair. And fellow babies, I was hooked. I wanted all the information I could find on Bigfoot. But this was the 70s. You know, a primitive time with no internet, no cell phones. You know, the dark ages. But there was still a lot of information out there. The Legend of Boggy Creek was a big hit in the theaters. Leonard Nimoy's TV show In Search Of did an episode on Bigfoot. Peter Graves hosted a documentary called The Mysterious Monsters, which included a segment on Bigfoot. And who can forget the episodes of The $6 Million Man where Steve Austin encountered and fought Bigfoot? Okay, if you don't know who Steve Austin is, and I'm not talking about the wrestler, Google it. You gotta stay up on your cultural references. Come on, man. Anyway, the book I read and all these movies and the TV shows focused primarily on the Pacific Northwest. So I grew up thinking that if I was ever going to have a chance to hunt for a Bigfoot, I was going to have to go west. Well, to the Pacific Northwest anyway. Years later, I was still fascinated by Bigfoot, but, you know, life and career get in the way. But one day while surfing the internet, I came across the website for the BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. And through their website, I found out about John Green's landmark book, Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us. And it was through this book that I learned that Bigfoot sightings are not confined to just the Pacific Northwest. That there have been Bigfoot sightings in most states, including West Virginia, where I was born and raised, and Tennessee, where I currently live. Reading John Green's classic book reignited the passion. I started getting out into the woods, going Bigfooting. I started a website on Tennessee sightings, www.tnbigfoot.net. I did a radio show and now a podcast. I want to tell you, though, that I was worried that this might be a very short-lived podcast. I don't know if you saw it, but there was a headline on foxnews.com a few weeks back about the rarest mammal in the U.S. being found in a garage. And I thought, holy cow. Bigfoot researchers have been spending so much time out in the woods, beating the bushes, and all we had to do was look in some schmuck's garage? But it turns out it wasn't Bigfoot that was found in a garage. It was a black-footed ferret. Aww. I have posted a picture of a black-footed ferret on our Facebook page, facebook.com/BigfootTennessee, and on BigfootCrossing.net on the episode info page. Click on the episode 1 link. And while you're on the website, be sure to check out the Bigfoot Crossing web store.
Shameless plug.
Now, the black-footed ferret is the only ferret species that is native to the U.S., and it is an endangered species. The Fish and Wildlife folks in Colorado have been reintroducing the black-footed ferret into the wild, and one wandered away from its colony and wound up in a garage. But the little guy was healthy and apparently tagged, and so the Fish and Wildlife folks were able to transport him back to his colony. So Bigfoot has not yet been discovered by science, and we Bigfoot researchers can continue to go out into the woods and continue the hunt that science largely ignores. But maybe check out a few garages once in a while. It couldn't hurt. You know, I started the Bigfoot Crossing radio program in a great way with an interview of John Bindernagel, a Canadian field biologist and author of two books on Bigfoot. And beginning that show that way, as great as it was, carried with it an assumption that most folks who were listening knew a lot about Bigfoot. And that really wasn't a good assumption to make. After all, based on that survey I mentioned earlier, only about 30% of folks believe that Bigfoot is a real creature. So think about this. Let's say a Bigfoot sighting makes the news, and the reporter can barely keep a straight face as he reports on the sighting. And then the reporter closes out his story by pointing out that the scientific community rejects the notion that Bigfoot is a real but unidentified creature. So folks watching that newscast have just heard two influential entities, one the reporter and two modern science, dismiss out of hand the idea that an unclassified creature is walking the forests of North America. Are those folks likely to dig any deeper into the question? No! They're going to accept what they're told. And they're going to think, I don't want to get made fun of like that poor schmuck just did. And that's why I welcome skeptics to listen to this podcast. Because this time I want to lay a good foundation of very basic information. And fellow babies, I mean very basic. Now, if this were a police show, the police would start with a description of the suspect. They would want to gather as much information as possible on what the suspect looks like and the suspect's habits. So I think that's a good place for us to start. Let's start by asking the question, just what the heck does a Bigfoot look like? And class is in session. I'm going to kick off this first episode of the Bigfoot Crossing Podcast the same way I kicked off the first episode of the radio program, by reading a passage from the landmark book on the subject of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us, by John Green. This book is available from Hancock House Publishers at www.hancockhouse.com and at bigfootcrossing.net on the BFC web store. Podcast listeners can get a 15% discount.
A shameless plug.
This is from Chapter 1 of Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us, and the chapter is entitled The Ape in the Night. You are sitting alone in the house at night when you hear a slight noise outside, and turning your head you are confronted by a bestial black face, more like a gorilla's than anything else, staring in the window at you. It's a horror movie come true, the most terrifying thing you have ever experienced. Yet somehow you survive it, and after a while the face is gone. The reason you survived is simple. You were never in any danger in the first place. An animal looked in out of the darkness to see what was inside your lighted room, but it wasn't trying to get in to eat you, and it felt no hostility towards you. It was just curious and for some reason abandoned its usual caution. In reality, you were granted a rare privilege, a chance for a close look at one of the most interesting creatures on Earth, and one that very few people ever see. It's too bad you weren't in shape to appreciate it. The face in your window belonged to a Sasquatch, which is either a legend, in which case it is odd that you were able to see it, or the largest of the apes, an ape that lives in North America and that walks upright like a man. Rest in peace, John Green. Now let's get to the matter at hand, describing a Bigfoot. And just like the police, we're going to do that by taking a look at some eyewitness descriptions. Now there have been thousands of sighting reports over the years, but we're just going to look at a handful and see what we can learn. Our first eyewitness account is provided by a Mr. Hamilton from Greene County, Arkansas. And Mr. Hamilton was out hunting with a friend, and he and his friend observed a herd of cattle in a state of alarm, apparently being pursued by a predator. And as the men waited and watched the behavior of the cattle, they soon saw the reason for that behavior. Chasing after the cattle was an animal of gigantic stature, covered in hair with shoulder-length hair on its head, running on 2 feet. And upon seeing the two hunters, the animal beat a hasty retreat. The men later measured the footprints at 13 inches long. Now, according to 2bigfeet.com, that's the number 2, bigfeet.com, a 13-inch foot is the equivalent of a size 17 shoe. And the beast had been reported in the area for approximately 17 years prior to Mr. Hamilton's reported sighting. Our next account comes from Florida, where Mr. H.C. Osborne reported seeing a hairy creature with no neck. The creature left a horrible smell behind, along with footprints that were 17.5 inches long and 11 inches wide at the toe span. Mr. Osborne estimated that the animal was 7 feet tall and weighed approximately 800 pounds. Let's give some context for that 17.5-inch footprint. Andre the Giant wore a size 22 shoe. So does Shaquille O'Neal. A size 22 shoe is 15 to 16 inches long, and this was a 17.5-inch footprint. Clearwater County, Idaho is the source for our next report. The witness reported seeing with his spotlight a hairy animal covered in matted, dirty-looking brown hair moving quickly away from him. The witness estimated the animal to be 8 to 8.5 feet tall and about 3 to 3.5 feet wide at the shoulders. The witness further stated that the animal had long arms and was, quote, extremely powerfully built, end quote. The witness stated that the animal had a very fluid stride and covered 5 to 6 feet in a single stride. The witness followed the animal with his spotlight for approximately 80 yards, which the animal covered in 4 to 5 seconds, traveling uphill in a ravine. The kicker in this account? The witness was a trained observer, a deputy sheriff with the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department. Our next report comes from the state of Washington and also involves law enforcement. Around 2:30 a.m. on October 24, 1975, a sergeant on the police force for an Indian reservation answered a call about something prowling behind a house. Upon arrival at the house, the sergeant's spotlight picked up what looked like a very large ape standing in the backyard. The sergeant walked to within 35 feet of the animal, which crouched down, and the sergeant and the animal remained in their positions for, quote, many minutes, unquote, while the sergeant tried to figure out what to do next. The sergeant noted that the animal was covered in short black hair except for its face, was 7 to 8 feet tall, and appeared to have no neck. Its nose was flat. He could see the nostrils. He could not see any ears for the hair, but the eyes were small. And upon being informed that there was another creature in the trees to the right of the sergeant and the men helping him backed off. In 1993 in British Columbia, Canada, a hunter spotted a large reddish-brown ape-like animal standing on the lower branch of a tree. The animal was not aware of the hunter's presence until the hunter whistled at it. The animal jumped from the tree, landing on 2 feet, and then ran away on 2 feet, turning to look back at the hunter right as it entered the tree line. The hunter described the animal as over 6 feet tall and, quote, really wide, end quote. And our last eyewitness report takes us right into the 21st century and is courtesy of the website for the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, www.bfro.net. In December 2018, 4 golfers at the Whitewater Creek Golf Course near Fayetteville, Georgia, saw a large animal covered in black hair walk from the tree line onto the golf course, just as they were approaching the tee box. Now, I haven't golfed in years, but when I did, I was a scratch golfer. I really was. I'd hit the ball and then scratch my head wondering how in the world I could make such a terrible shot. Anyway, I'm pretty sure that there is no rule of etiquette in golf about what to do when a Bigfoot walks onto the golf course. Do you yell for? Do you let him play through? I think you are pretty much on your own in that situation. Well, I'm not sure if these guys yelled for, but they yelled at the animal, which then ducked down behind a log. and after a few seconds the animal got up and returned to the woods the way it came. The golfers described the animal as being covered in black hair, quote, like a beautiful jet black mink coat, end quote, 7 feet tall or larger, with huge shoulders and arms. So what kind of description can we cobble together based upon just 6 eyewitness reports? Well, we have a tall, hair-covered creature, 7 to 8.5 feet tall, very wide at the shoulders with little or no neck, and an ape-like face with a flat nose. Hair color ranges from brown to reddish-brown to black, and the creature is habitually bipedal, as evidenced by its smooth, striding gait. So how does this compare with the thousands of Bigfoot sightings that have been reported over the years? Amazingly, spot on. Based upon thousands of sighting reports, a composite description of Bigfoot has been developed. A huge hair-covered creature that is habitually bipedal. It is not a knuckle walker like chimps or gorillas, nor does it go down on all fours like a bear. Reported hair colors include brown, reddish-brown, black, and gray. Bigfoot is described as being very broad across the shoulders with little to no neck and long arms that reach to the knees. A cone-shaped head that is higher in the back with an ape-like face. The hands and feet resemble large versions of human hands and feet. And height estimates range from 6 to 11 feet tall, with the creature's weight estimated at 300 to 1,200 pounds. Footprint measurements range from 13 to 22 inches long. So, as I said, the description that we cobbled together based upon 6 sighting reports is spot on with the composite description derived from thousands of sighting reports. Now, you might be asking yourself, why didn't he just start off with the composite description? Well, before I answer that question, let's consider the chupacabra, the blood-sucking cryptid of Latin America. The first sighting of a chupacabra was reported in 1995 by a woman in Puerto Rico who described a bipedal reptilian creature with long arms, claws, dark eyes, and distinctive spikes along its back. At the time of the sighting, the science fiction/horror movie Species was in the theaters, and the witness, who prior to her encounter had seen the movie, even stated in interviews how similar the chupacabra was to the movie monster. And all sightings of the chupacabra in Latin American communities spring from that first Hollywood-influenced report. And then a strange thing happened. About 5 years later, around the year 2000, the descriptions of the chupacabra changed, and changed dramatically. No longer was the chupacabra a bipedal reptilian creature. The chupacabra became a hairless, 4-legged creature that resembled a hairless canine. Alleged chupacabra carcasses were found in necropsied and found to be dogs and coyotes with a parasitic condition that caused them to lose all their hair, develop a thick skin, and take on a somewhat monstrous appearance. So why didn't I just start with the composite description of Bigfoot? Well, 2 reasons, fellow babies. 1, that would have made for a very short podcast episode. And 2, I wanted to demonstrate the remarkable consistency in Bigfoot descriptions over a long period of time. In just 5 years, the description of a chupacabra changed completely. But over decades, the description of a Bigfoot has remained constant. And I consider that remarkable consistency in descriptions to be evidence of Bigfoot's existence. Now, the skeptic in the audience today is probably thinking, well, of course the descriptions are similar. That's because every Bigfoot sighting is just a person in a gorilla costume. Wrong answer. I can tell you right now that statement is 100% false. Have Bigfoot hoaxes been perpetrated using a gorilla costume or a ghillie suit? Absolutely. But not every Bigfoot sighting is a person in a gorilla suit. How can I be so sure of that, you ask? Well, remember the very first sighting we covered? Mr. Hamilton in Greene County, Arkansas. That sighting was reported in the Memphis Inquirer newspaper on May 9th, 1851. And remember that the report stated that the creature had been seen in the area for 17 years prior to Mr. Hamilton's reported sighting. In other words, as early as 1834. Now, gorillas were not described in scientific literature until 1847. So how was someone in 1834 supposed to get a gorilla costume when no one knew what a gorilla looked like? So, if every Bigfoot sighting is not a person in a gorilla suit or a ghillie suit, what have people been seeing and reporting since the 1830s, the 1840s, the 1850s, and continuing right up to the present? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at next time. Be sure to join us right here at Bigfoot Crossing as we play a game called Classify That Critter, and attempt to determine just what the heck a Bigfoot is. This episode of Bigfoot Crossing was brought to you by thinkbeforeyoudrink.us. Change your water, change your life with Kangen water. For more information and an eye-opening description, be sure to go to www.thinkbeforeyoudrink.us. And a special thanks to Hancock House Publishers, the home of cryptozoology, for allowing us to quote from Sasquatch the Apes Among Us by John Green. Again, this book is available for purchase at hancockhouse.com and at the Bigfoot Crossing web store. Podcast listeners get a 15% discount.
Shameless plug.
Finally, fellow babies, I'd like to dedicate this episode of the Bigfoot Crossing Podcast to the memory of my dear friend, brother in Christ, and partner in Bigfooting, Larry Lee. Larry passed from this life on December 31st, 2020. Rest in the Lord, my friend. All right, there's the bell. Thanks so much for being with us today. Please join us next time right here at Bigfoot Crossing. Now get out of here.
We hope you have enjoyed your visit with us here at Bigfoot Crossing. The internet home for Bigfoot Crossing can be found at www.bigfootcrossing.net. Michael Willey's website, Bigfoot in Tennessee, can be found at www.tnbigfoot.net. Please follow us on Facebook at Bigfoot Tennessee. You can also follow Michael Willey on Twitter. His handle is at Michael B. Willey. Each episode of Bigfoot Crossing is posted to the Bigfoot Crossing YouTube channel. Please subscribe so you can be notified when new episodes are posted. Your feedback is always welcome. Please email questions and comments to tnsasquatch@gmail.com. Be sure to let us know which episode you have a question or comment about. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here at Bigfoot Crossing.
This is Brock Whitmore, live on the scene. Sir, did you see what happened?
Yeah, did.